we learn and remember new information by attaching it to
How do you tell the difference then, Jason, between something that's truly fundamental, you need to keep doing it, versus it's like, no, you know what, you need to move on from that other thing?
John Mackey was the co-founder of Whole Foods. He told me that he attributes a lot of his success to one thing, which was his willingness to always ask, what does the business need from me now? To then dedicate himself to whatever the answer to that question is.
How can we help the listeners say you have to make time to go back to the fundamentals? Something's got to give somewhere, though. How do we make sure we've got those reserves when we need them?
We tend to think about productivity as fitting the most number of tasks into the allotted amount of time. But there's another way of thinking about productivity, which is that productivity is actually business is storytelling. And if you are not properly communicating in a way that reaches people at their level of understanding and their context, then they don't understand you, and then they won't follow you, they won't buy from you.
My very special guest is the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine, host of the podcast Problem Solvers, and co-host of the podcast Help Wanted. He's also the author of the book Build for Tomorrow, which helps readers find new opportunities in times of change. He also writes a fantastic newsletter called One Thing Better, where each week he gives you one better way to build a career or a company you love. He is Jason Feifer. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Hey, thanks for that really nice intro.
That's the best I could do. I just whip that out. You know, that's what I like to do, the way I like to roll.
It was well done. I feel very welcomed.
Well, I mentioned your fabulous newsletter. I've been getting it for a long time now.
Thank you.
I just wanted to get a deeper dive on a couple of your recent installments. I just really want to use that as a launching off point. What do you think?
Sure, let's do it.
One of the ones that came out recently you had titled How to Reach the Next Level. And you mentioned that having success, at some point you had this perspective that in your mind, at least, you're thinking like, oh, I get to move on. I don't have to do those things that I used to do, you know, in order to get to this place. Just kind of set the scene for us a little bit. What was going on there?
Yeah, well, that came out of this realization that, okay, for context, I travel and do a lot of keynote speakings. Companies hire me to give talk. I've been doing it this year, every week to every other week. I've been on the road. And in the past, I had decided that I was experienced enough that I didn't need to practice anymore. That practicing was this almost embarrassing idea for amateurs, and that I have graduated from practicing. But you know, what I also came to realize was that sometimes I was excellent and sometimes I was not as excellent. Sometimes I would reach a moment on stage and I would think to myself, oh crap, I kind of forgot what happens next. And so I made this commitment to myself this year. And that commitment was, I will practice before every talk. I don't care if I just gave that talk like yesterday. I'm going to run through it in my hotel room the night before or the morning of every single talk. And I have found it to be an incredibly valuable process. I am better on stage. I am more confident on stage. I also am constantly running into problems in the hotel room. Like I'm constantly hitting a moment where I was like, oh, wait, I forgot that line. Or like, oh, wait, where does that go again? It's amazing how fast this stuff atrophies in your brain, even if you do it all the time. And that got me to this realization, which was that we often think that we can graduate from the fundamentals of whatever it is that we do. And when we do that, we actually just decrease our own value. That being great and reaching the next level of whatever it is, right? For me, it would be reaching the next level of payment or the next level of clients, requires a doubling down on the fundamentals of whatever it is that you do, rather than thinking that you are better than them. And I mean, I was just in Houston yesterday for when we were talking, and I ran through that talk in my hotel room, and it was so much better as a result. And I'm so grateful that I have now dedicated myself to doing that.
It kind of breaks your brain a little bit because you're thinking like, shouldn't I be able to move on? I've mastered the fundamentals. Certain things should be so easy, and it's almost deceptively so. A lot of times, you know, I watch some stand-up comedy, for example. You see somebody with a Netflix special, you're like, oh man, they just make it look so natural. You're like, they've told those jokes 100 times in front of live audiences, toning that in. It's unbelievable.
You know, like a funny, stupid realization for me as I was thinking about this was thinking about professional sports and how the greatest basketball players in the world who play for the NBA, and I mean, this is true for everything, but I like basketball. Those guys practice like every day. Like they are the best in the world at what they do. And they practice every day before a game. They warm up before. And if they have to do that, then everybody else has to do that too, right? And you'll look, obviously there's different kinds of fundamentals. Like nobody at the NBA is like taking a class on how to dribble a basketball. But like to understand what are the drivers of your success and making sure that you are repeatedly returning to them and making sure that your fundamentals are strong. Without that, you just simply cannot build strongly on top of them.
It does create a certain challenge for managers. I know a lot of times we have these, especially early career managers, when it's their first assignment, they were strong individual contributors. And one of the things they sometimes have a hard time letting go of is what they used to do. And they still continue to go back to that comfort zone of, I just know how to do this stuff. And they don't necessarily take out the new management stuff. How do you tell the difference then, Jason, between when it's something that's truly fundamental, you need to keep doing it versus it's like, no, you know what? You need to move on from that other thing.
Well, what you said there reminds me of a conversation that I had a little while ago with John Mackey. So John Mackey was the co-founder of Whole Foods, and he was the CEO for 40 something years or some long amount of time. And he told me that he attributes a lot of his success and the longevity of his leadership at Whole Foods to one thing, which was his willingness to always ask, what does the business need from me now? And to then dedicate himself to whatever the answer to that question is. So as the answer changes, he must dedicate himself to understanding the fundamentals of whatever that new need is. Now, for him, the way in which he thought about it was that what John was really good at the very beginning was real estate. He was great at being leading that team of identifying a new Whole Foods location and being very involved in the development of that space. But, later on, as his career progressed and his Whole Foods grew, they didn't need him to do that anymore. They had a team to do that. And instead, things that they needed from him, for example, were to be more of the face of the brand and to interface with the press and so on. And he didn't know how to do that, and he didn't particularly like it. But he realized that that was what the business needed of him now. So he needed to now rework, or not rework, he needed to work on new fundamentals. And so now he needs to understand and really take seriously, what does it mean to be on camera? How do I get media trained? How do I figure out what my talking points are? And then to return to those skills over and over again, instead of holding on to the things that used to work for him. And so your question is a good one. And the answer is that there will always be new tasks required of us and new fundamentals that must be developed and then maintained. And a great starting point is to be stepping back and asking, not what do I find the most comfortable, but rather what is needed of me right now for the larger organization to succeed.
I love that. And going back to your title, like how to get that next level, sometimes it's sounding like discernment of knowing when it's time to move on to a new set of tasks because the other ones are either better done by somebody else or going to hold you or your organization back. But don't be so prideful that you get to the point where you're saying like, I don't need to be fundamental because I've just mastered this. It's like not the highest performers in the world. You mentioned the sports or orchestra or anything like that. They're still going back to those fundamentals over and over again, even if we don't necessarily see or celebrate that quite as much.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, when you're a NBA player, you need to practice basketball every day. When you retire from the NBA, you don't need to practice basketball every day. That's very obvious, but the point being made here is obviously depending on what it is required of you, the fundamentals that you're going to work on are going to be different. But I've met many former professional athletes who then get into business and are humbling themselves to have very basic conversations, do a tour of talking to investors and founders and just be in learning mode, which is a challenge for someone who used to be at the top of their game and definitely not in learning mode, right? Maria Sharapova, I had this conversation with. Maria Sharapova did not need to be in learning mode for tennis towards the end of her career, though she did need to practice all the time, which she would well say herself. But then she retired from tennis and she got into investing and advising, and she wants to be a student now. And she wants to walk into rooms and say, look, I just because I'm good at tennis doesn't mean that I'm good at this. So I'm going to need people to teach me and to show me what to do, and we're going to grow together. And I think that's really healthy.
I like that a lot. It's all about mindset. And I know that some of the listeners are probably out there thinking, oh no, Jason's telling me I got to make time to go back to the fundamentals. You're talking about rehearsing in your hotel room the night before when you could be watching SportsCenter or doing something else. Where does all this energy come from? How can we help the listeners say, you have to make time to go back to the fundamentals? Something's got to give somewhere though. How do we make that, make sure we've got those reserves when we need them?
I had a conversation 2 years ago or something with a woman who's since become a good friend. Her name is Catherine Morgan Schaffler, and she's a psychotherapist. Wrote a great book called The Perfectionist's Guide to Losing Control. And Catherine was telling me that we need to rethink the way in which we think about productivity. So we tend to think about productivity as fitting the most number of tasks into the allotted amount of time. But there's another way of thinking about productivity, which is that productivity is actually about making sure that we're maintaining the energy to do those tasks. Because if all we're doing is focused on the tasks, we will run out of energy to do the tasks, and then the tasks don't get done. So what if we were to think of taking a walk as productive? Because we clear our mind, we come back more refreshed. Getting coffee with a friend as productive. Taking a nap as productive. Anything that restores energy that can then be put into tasks and other things is productive. And I said to Catherine, I really like that, but what would you say to someone who has 16 hours worth of things to do and not 16 hours to do them, only 12, only 8 hours to do them? And she said, well, then I would encourage you to ask yourself this: what's the point of building something if you can't maintain it? And that is a powerful question, one that I grapple with all the time. And the answer really is that to maintain things is to be really mindful of what matters and what balance looks like. I, like you, I'm sure, and like people who are listening to this show, I am an opportunity seeker. And I have a hard time saying no to things that excite me. And yet, you know what I will do is sometimes I will take something on and then I will assess whether or not I can really do justice for the commitment that I've made. And then I will recalibrate. I'm doing that right now with a couple different projects where I've said, look, we talked about me doing this, and I'm going to take less money because I'm not able to deliver for you what you really need from me. So let's focus in on only the things that you could only get from me, right? Like you don't need me to write something. Somebody else could write something. You need me to be in the room for that important meeting with the client because then you have me and it's whatever the case is. And siphon off other things. I don't know. How did I make the time to practice when I was in Houston? The answer is you'd mentioned SportsCenter. I basically stopped watching sports. I used to love sports. I don't watch sports anymore. I don't have the time. There's no the time. Something had to give, and that's the thing that's going to give. So when I go to a new city, I basically just think to myself, I've got two things to do here. If I have a friend in town, I would like to see them, get dinner, but I'm also going to make sure that either before or after I am going to set aside that time to do that work. It just has to get done. You have to prioritize what really matters, and then you build around it. And if things have to go, then you have to embrace that and focus on it and say, I am building towards something bigger here than these individual little component parts. And we need to understand how we are building something we can maintain.
Yeah, there's real gems in there too. You're coming down to what's your priority here, trying to make trade-offs, trying to, I think for people listening in, you probably have a team. Are you delegating effectively? Do we have to do all of these things? And I think that the biggest one is from the book is the mindset of saying like, what does productivity really mean? Why are we trying to be as productive as we think we are sometimes? So not easy, simple, but not easy, right? One of those situations.
Simple, but not easy, I think basically summarizes all of business. It's It's like I have these conversations all day about business and business fundamentals, and it's not like none of it's rocket science. It's just that just like the fundamentals, just keeping it all in your head and making sure that you're doing it all is really hard. And it's the reason why these kinds of conversations matter, because we're often not. I don't know. I don't know how often I'm actually saying something that's like completely new and mind-blowing to people. What I'm often doing is I'm helping them remember or appreciate something that feels intuitively correct and that they may have already learned in some way, but they forgot or didn't understand the value of or hadn't fully committed themselves to.
I think the other thing that you do really well is to not only remind us of the things that we need, but you have this way of putting a real wrapper on it that's relatable, it's straightforward, it's very sort of friendly in that way, it's accessible, right? And I think that a lot of times you can find very academic tomes, you can find, these people like John Mackey who've done these amazing things, and that's great and inspiring too. But I think when you hear it coming in from every different angle, sometimes the light hits you just right.
Yep.
That's what I find from your stuff that I really appreciate.
I appreciate that. So that's strategic, and I'm really glad that you pick up on it. Here's the way in which I think about learning. So I had a conversation many years ago with a university professor. I can't remember exactly what she studies, but anyway, one of the things she studies is how people learn. Like, what is literally the mechanisms by which we learn. And she told me this really interesting thing, which is that we learn, among many other things, but just to be clear and simple about it, we learn through what she called scaffolding, which is to say that we learn and remember new information by attaching it to existing information. So if you already understand, let's just say, the mechanics of a car, then someone can come and tell you something new about the car or this new part or this new something. And that fits inside of an existing structure of information that you have. And therefore, you can process it and remember it and make it useful. But when I am reading the scanning around on Apple News and I come across a really cool story about some black hole that was discovered, 70 million light years away, and I read it and it's really interesting, I don't retain any of it afterwards because I don't have the foundational knowledge. I don't have the scaffolding of astronomy to really understand this information or to put it into context somewhere. So we learn by scaffolding. We attach new information to old information. So when I'm giving you something new, if I give it to you in a vacuum, if it's just a tip, it doesn't really land and it doesn't connect with you because it feels abstract. So instead, I like to tell a story, some kind of anecdote coming from somewhere, giving you something familiar, whether it's Whole Foods or Maria Sharapova or whatever, so that becomes the memorable scaffolding. We, as humans, process things and information through narrative. So if I can tell you a story that's relatable, then you now have a framework by which to attach my new idea to. And that's the reason why I communicate in the way that I do. I have a formula when I write, and I often even follow it when I'm just answering questions in short on a podcast like this, which is big idea, followed by some story that brings it to life, followed by some kind of exercise or takeaway or something that you can do. And I'm modifying that all the time, but I find that, you set it up with a big idea so people know what's coming. You give a story so that you create some scaffolding in their brain, and then you give the exercise or the information or the takeaway that attaches to the scaffolding that they're going to remember because they remember that you just talked about John Mackey. And that works.
And I love the fact that it's so localizable, I guess I'd say. So whether you're on stage, you're talking to 1,000 people in the room, you're doing that. But also that's the same formula you see play out a lot of times in your social posts on LinkedIn, where you've got this anchor piece. And usually you've been doing these great posts I've been seeing lately where you're taking old advertisements and things, FedEx commercials. I saw one from Volvo with Jean-Claude Van Damme recently. And it's amazing because then here comes the idea, the story punctuates it, and then here comes the application bits too. And it's very effective. And the reason I bring that up is because we got leaders listening on this call who are not telling great stories. They're thinking the data is going to, carry the day, or the rationality alone is going to do it. And it doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's very repeatable.
It doesn't. You really need, business is storytelling. And if you are not properly communicating in a way that reaches people at their level of understanding and their context, then they don't understand you, and then they won't follow you, they won't buy from you. So everybody has to think of themselves as a communicator.
And then the last question for you on this part of the topic here is, where do your ideas come from? You have such a diversity of these stories that you're bringing in. You've got conversations you're having. You're just seeing things. You're just always scanning the horizon, looking for lessons. Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, more or less. I think that the greatest ideas come from real life and from real conversation. We're all a wealth of knowledge, and we are all also engaging with people all the time. And we remember through association. So, if you were to ask me, just like out of absolutely nowhere, give me your 3 best tips for marketing or something, like, I don't know. I don't have that off the top of my head. But if we had a conversation about marketing, you would say something and it would remind me of this thing. And then I would say it. And then as I'm talking, it would remind me of some other thing. Right? That's how we remember. So if you want to get the best information out of yourself, then the way you do that is you program yourself to be constantly monitoring your own words and your own conversations, and then stopping whenever something really interesting comes up and writing it down. So I keep I organize in a couple different ways in my notes app on my iPhone, and then also my reminders app. I use them for different things. And I just keep lists of this idea, that idea. I said this person asked me that question, whatever. And then I return to those things and I think, how can I unpack that into something bigger, whether that's a newsletter or a podcast or a book chapter or whatever.
You don't want those good ideas to get away. I love it.
You'll forget them.
Yeah.
You'll forget them otherwise.
Well, those are the good ideas. I have a terrible idea, and that's, let's play a trivia game real quick.
Let's do it.
I saw in one of these podcast interviews you did that one of your first entrepreneurial ventures was selling painted rocks in Southern California.
Oh, that's so funny. Yes, that's true. Not in Southern California. That was,
it was
Southern
in Florida.
Southern Florida. Yes.
I misspoke.
Yeah.
I had it in my nose. And so I'm going to get us a question about geology that neither of us knows what's going to happen. AI is going to ask us this question. I'm just going to be just to be clear for anybody who's confused by that. When you say one of my first entrepreneurial ventures, we're talking when I was like 8 years old, right? Like it wasn't like I was 40 and trying to sell painted rocks. Although maybe that's a good business. I don't know. You never know.
Yes, this was a childhood thing. Yes. Okay.
Exactly. But here's our question for you. Here comes Jason. What is the name for the naturally occurring solid cohesive aggregate of one or more minerals? Think of something you might find a lot when hiking in the mountains. Oh, goodness.
What? Say that again.
So we have the name for the naturally occurring solid cohesive aggregate of one or more minerals. Think of something you might find a lot of when hiking in the mountains.
I mean, that sounds like a fancy way of saying the word rock. Are we talking rock or stone?
Is that simple? Can it be that bad? Jason, you got it. The answer is rock. Holy cow. AI, I tell you, we are still well in control. I'm not worried about that at all at this point.
That's awesome. What a fancy way of saying the word rock.
Yeah.
I will tell you that I just recently bought a rock, and it's a little more than a rock, but I sort of, that's what my shorthand for it, which is a rock, which is that I came upon in this kind of interesting museum gallery thing where you could, things were rare and also for sale. I came across a Neolithic flint core. So this is Neolithic, this late Stone Age, dawn of agriculture. Flint core is flint rock, which is very dense rock, and then a core is just like a big chunk of it. And back in the Neolithic era, the Stone Age, they would take these chunks of flint that they would find, I actually don't know where they would come from. They'd chisel them off of something, I guess. And then they had a very strategic way of kind of chipping off thin slices of that rock, which they would then use to turn into arrowheads and knives and the very basic tools of life, weapons and tools of life. And so this is the source material for the very beginning of everything, as far as I'm concerned, right? Like everything that you and I are talking about today, if you rewind far enough back, what you get is like a rock that people chipped off of and turned into the very first tools. And I just became obsessed with it. And so I bought this thing. And it now sits, it certainly didn't cost nothing, but it was actually kind of less expensive than I originally assumed it was going to be. And I now have it in my living room. And I every time someone comes over, I show them this rock, and I because it's mine now, I get to let them hold this 6,000-year-old thing, and I really love it. So anyway, I guess I've returned to rocks.
You've returned cohesive aggregates as far as they go. That's a beautiful one. It's symbolic all the way back to our earliest tools, and certainly quite a lineage, all the way up till now. But
yeah,
I got a much better question for you, Jason, which is, where can my listeners go to learn more about you and all the great things that you're doing?
Well, I appreciate that. So I'll tell you something. If you give people many ways to reach you, they will do none of them. But if you give them one, then they might. So I'm just going to go with, Matt, you had mentioned my podcast at the beginning. I mean, not my podcast. I do have a podcast. You mentioned my newsletter at the beginning. So I'm just going to tell you that you can find that newsletter at onethingbetter.email. So that's a web address. You can plug it into a browser, onethingbetter.email. And I share every week a lot of the kinds of stuff that we've been talking about on this show.
You certainly do. I love it. I'm a subscriber, and listeners, I'm going to have that link for you in the show notes. You're only one click away from getting good stuff from Jason every week. Jason, thanks so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.